It usually takes a few minutes for everybody to file in, especially with so many folks coming into one session. So we'll give everybody a minute to, as I've been saying, come in and find a seat.
Which we may be doing in person here soon.
I hope so. Certainly, hopefully some of the folks in the room right now are going to be able to go to the NADCP conference in August. And Mack was just telling me last night he's going to have a couple presentations there. So
yep,
I'm sure you're going to gain some fans here today, Mack.
Well, that's
some additional fans here today, Mack. You're going to be at your session in DC.
I hope so. I would love that. And you'll help me out again at 10 minutes and 5 minutes, right?
I will.
Remember.
I will. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to our final and exciting session with Mack. He is closing out the conference for us. No pressure or anything. Closing out the conference for us, and I'm happy to see everybody here. I am not going to read his bio or get into a long bio. Mack is extremely qualified to present on this topic. He's retired now, but he was the chief probation officer in San Diego County for many, many years. And are you still on the NADCP board?
Nope, just finished my second term, so I'm no longer on the board.
But one of the first things I remember him telling me when I first met Mack is that he knew Carolyn before she actually had her job at NADCP, or I mean that he was on the hiring team or something like that, right? For Carolyn.
It wasn't a hiring team, but I did meet Carolyn before she was in her current position, and Carolyn will back me up on that.
So that gives you an idea of how long Mack has not only been doing the work in his own community and in his own state, but how long Mack has been a part of the recovery court, drug court movement in this country. So I'm going to turn it over to Mack and be quiet so that he can share his information with you. Take it away, Mack.
Thank you, Marie. And so as Marie said, yes, my name is Mack Jenkins. I am a retired chief probation officer, and I've actually spent more than 40 years of working in the justice system, all in probation, all in California. And my experience in treatment courts, recovery courts, and I'll go back and forth with that term, actually dates back to 1995, which was just, 7 years or 6 years after the inception of treatment courts in the country in Dade County, Florida in 1989, when Orange County made the decision that they would launch a drug court. And I was involved in the construction of that from the very beginning. And then from there, as things grew both around the country and locally, I was one of the early practitioners. And so that means I've been directly involved in the treatment court community, the recovery court community. What is that? 1995, 5 years, then add now 21 years, about 26 years. And so part of what I'll be talking with you about today comes from that experience and what I've done to try and learn along the way. Now, what I'll do now is go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint so that I can remember, and I'll share a little bit more of the background of what I'll be talking about. So give me just 1 second. All right, hopefully everyone can see that now. It should say
it's up. It's
perfect.
Up.
Okay, thank you. So again, this has been a passion, quite honestly. When I was first involved in the creation of our courts in Orange County, California, again, as a probation executive, my part there was to bring the probation piece to what we were constructing in Orange County. And I will say back then, and this is actually really important, with the newness of the recovery courts at that time, there was not a lot of research about how to do it right. There was just a lot of passion, largely driven by bench officers, judges, about wanting to do something different with a repeat population in the criminal circuits. But we actually used to talk about, we need to do some research. We need to test to see what actually is working and what's not working. And that has now happened. Now, these, 30 plus years on, there's a body of research that shows us and tells us exactly what we should be doing and what we shouldn't. So what I will be covering today, it comes from that research, comes from certainly my experience, and I have tried to voraciously consume all of the research that comes out around not just the probation role or even the treatment role necessarily, but really what is the recovery court team. So I will be covering what you see in front of you, the aspect of supervising participants in a recovery court and the risk need responsivity model. If I were in person, if we were present right now, one of the things I would be asking all of you is how many of you are probation officers, how many of you are judges, how many of you are clinicians, etc. Because I'd be curious about that, because I'm not going to be trying to tell probation officers how to supervise people. That's not what this talk is about. I'm actually going to be talking about some concepts around supervising individuals in a recovery court and integrating the risk need responsivity model. The other thing that I would be asking you about is how much experience all of you have. Some of you may have been doing it as long as I have. Some of you may be brand new to this, but that is, it's interesting to know, because for some of you, I may not say anything that's particularly new. I hope to introduce some new concepts actually, and some suggested new practices, but some of you might be in the point where you're ready to learn a little bit more. So again, that's just kind of the setup. And with Marie, we've kind of worked out a little bit. I hope that there are questions, and you can, I think, share those questions in chat. And I will do my best to answer them. So here are some very specific things that we'll be talking about. I will be covering what the goals are of supervision in a recovery court. And I will talk about what some of those practices are in the context of recovery court. Again, this is not a lesson for probation officers and how you supervise people. That's not what this is. You hopefully already know that, those of you that are probation officers. And I will talk about, again, the risk need responsivity model as we can apply it, should apply it, even in a recovery court model. I don't know how many of you have heard of the risk need responsivity model or the RNR model. I expect those of you that are probation officers have heard it. And I would also expect that those of you that might be on the clinicians or the treatment side, maybe it's new to you. Maybe you haven't heard a lot about it. That has been my experience, candidly, in work that I've done around the country and here locally too, where treatment providers are not very familiar with it. But the gist of what I'll be saying has to do with what I'm describing as the collaborative application of the risk need and responsivity model in a treatment court, a recovery court context. And will be specifically talking about a term that I use. I don't know if other folks use it as well, but I call it integrated case planning and collaborative case management. So that's the whole focus of supervising in a recovery court model and the risk need responsivity. So let's go to answering the first question. So what do I mean? What do we mean when we are saying we're supervising in a recovery court? And I want to compare and contrast a little bit. But in this context, we're talking about the effort to proactively monitor behavior and program compliance of the participants. And I emphasize the word proactively. And the reason that I emphasize it is because many folks, I will say, outside of the justice system have a perception. And frankly, those folks in the justice system, if they've done probation for a long time, may represent that probation's work in terms of supervising a justice-involved population is entirely reactive. That what probation does is monitors someone who the court has placed on probation, imposed rules and regulations, and then even waited for those individuals to mess up and then jump in and arrest them, revoke them, or whatever. But in the context of what probation or supervision can bring to the recovery court, it's a proactive focus. We're trying to be out in front of things. And this next bullet is also really important for our conversation, because I'm talking about supervision as an element of case management services that recovery courts deliver to their participants, an element of case management. Now, here's another thing that I need to stop and make sure I emphasize. I will use some terms and I'll try and define the context of the terms, but case management is a term that's frequently used in the work we do now. Case management, case managers, and in a second, I will give you a definition. I will put that in a very specific context because it's important to some of the other things that I would like to emphasize. But supervision, not from just a probation perspective, but supervising as an element of case management, because it is really important that in the context of a recovery court, what probation, what supervision brings to the table, what is part of our contribution, one, clearly is to be a part of the team, but also to focus on facilitating behavior change. That is why these courts exist. To facilitate behavior change of a population that, well, candidly, outside of coming into these programs, maybe have not successfully changed their behavior in their justice system involvement, or outside of the programs that we put together, don't have a great likelihood of changing their behavior. So it's not about just punishing folks. It is about trying to work with individuals who, for many different reasons, have found themselves involved in the justice system, probably with substance use issues, mental health issues, and we're going to try and help them get better. So it's supervision from that specific context. So I told you I would give you a definition, or at least a context of case management as I'm relating to it, because again, you may all have your own definitions of case management. That's one of the things I suggest, by the way, is that you with all of your team members come to a common understanding of what you're meaning when you use that term. Because there may be many people, multiple players on your team who regard themselves as a case manager. But here are a couple of the definitions that I like. The first one, and I will read it: a collaborative process which assesses, plans, implements, coordinates, monitors, and evaluates the options and services required to meet an individual's health needs, using communication and available resources to promote cost-effective outcomes. Comes from the Case Management Society of America. Case management. So think about that for a second. Think about that definition, because part of what I'm suggesting to you is that is what recovery courts do with their participants collectively, not just the probation officer, frankly, not even just the clinician. There may be some team members who identify themselves as case managers, but that team, that multidisciplinary team, is providing case management of these individuals that are justice involved. Another more concise definition you see there: a system of support, monitoring, and advocacy to assist an individual through change. Now that one really hits on some really important points and some important elements that I will again try to emphasize here. A system of support, monitoring, and advocacy to assist an individual through change. So continuing on with kind of a definition of case management, you heard me say that supervision in a recovery court is an element. So years ago, well before I met Carolyn, by the way, and back when, even before Wes Huddleston was in his position as CEO, we did some work together for a publication that is still available. Actually, if you're really interested, it's called Case Management Services in a Drug Court, if I remember. And what we did when we produced that was we broke down case management into these 5 components: assessment, planning, linkage, monitoring, and advocacy. So again, I'm wanting you to hear that as part of the elements or components of case management for the rest of our discussion this morning. Assessment, and here, and I will make this point several times, I will be redundant on it. We're talking about at least 2 different types of assessment: criminal risk and need and clinical assessments. Those are two different types of assessments. And I am saying assessments. I am not saying screen. A criminal risk need assessment and a clinical assessment are part of the effort in a recovery court. I distinguish between a screen and an assessment, a screen being preliminary, trying to identify perhaps like a substance use screen or a clinical screen is to detect the presence of symptoms, if you will. Whereas an assessment is to dive deeper and make a further diagnosis of what actually is happening. But the assessment leads us to a case plan that is assessment driven. Linkage involves the effort to engage the individual that we're working with services to address the issues that have been identified in the assessment. So notice I am saying linkage and I'm talking about engagement. I'm not just talking about referral. So it's engaging individuals in the services and may also involve some direct service delivery. So then the next one is monitoring. And that's where I'm saying that supervision falls under one of the elements of case management, because monitoring, again, is proactively overseeing the progress towards goals. In other words, supervision, proactively overseeing. And then the last one here in the discussion of these elements is advocacy, working in the best interest of the participant. And I will tell you, as a probation officer, and I told you my probation career lasts for more than 40 years. So a lot of what I'm talking about right now is not what I learned in the beginning when I first became a probation officer. And I will tell you this, that when I started as a probation officer, I was not told that part of my role was to be an advocate for the individuals that we were supervising. And I actually resisted that, quite candidly, even when we put this document together. I'm not an advocate. That's not what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to watch them. But as I have learned and consumed more research and understood not only more about the focus of probation, but about the potential of what effectively applied supervision can do, it made sense to me and makes sense to me today that part of what our role is, when I say our probation, and what we contribute to the recovery court effort is to work in the best interest of the participant. What are we trying to do? We're trying to help the participant get better. That's part of, frankly, serving the community that the recovery courts serve. So those are the elements. So now, what are the objectives of supervision in a recovery court? This is also really important. And again, I want to come back and emphasize something I hope I said earlier. I'm talking to you today and I'm presenting some concepts, and this is a part of some concepts that I want to make sure that you understand. But I will also offer some suggested specific practices. And I hope to close actually with a checklist to make this even that much more productive for you. But from a conceptual standpoint, here's what I want you to think about. Here's what I want you to consider. You should be asking yourselves, what are we trying to do with the supervision effort or the supervision protocol, the supervision plan that we're bringing to a recovery court? What is it that we want to be the successful outcomes? And that's another way I like to frame this. So I will encourage all of you to look at this as outcomes of a well-designed and well-delivered supervision protocol in a recovery court. It should protect the public. It should provide a high and effective level of accountability on the participants. It should also deliver on deterring non-compliant behavior. Even as I talk about being focused on behavior change, I'm not saying that we leave the role of wanting to deter non-compliant behavior as we can. Also, it should detect behavior that, frankly, the team needs to respond to. It should detect and offer an opportunity for early intervention. And what I'm saying here is that a well-designed, a well-delivered supervision protocol can detect the process, if you will, of relapse. And what I've learned, this is one of the things that I've learned over the course of my work in recovery courts, is that relapse is a process that ends in a new use. A process, and that process has signs, triggers, if you will, or even if not triggers, risk areas that if we're doing our supervision job well at the court, is doing collaborative case management well, we might well recognize those signs and intervene early so that we can interrupt that process before it results to a return to use. The other objective of a well-designed, well-delivered supervision protocol is to support the participant progress. Again, I want to, those of you that have been doing this for a while, think about if that's what you, how you were trained when you first became a probation officer. Not saying that wasn't your interest, that you probably came into the role wanting to support people that were just as involved. I'm asking, were you trained that way? So we're talking about it here from that perspective, that we're wanting to support positive progress. Part of a practical example of that is as you're out supervising, and supervising means making contacts both in the office and out in the field when visiting homes, and you find individuals either doing something they should be doing or engaged in a way that they should be engaged, you support that with positive reinforcement. From a team perspective, you'll come back and want to be talking about the kinds of incentives that you can apply to further support that. And then it's also, the next one down, serving as an adjunct to treatment. Adjunct to treatment. The supervision component, probation on your team, whoever's playing this role, whether it is a probation officer, whether it's a case manager or whomever, are not the primary treatment providers. I'm not talking about a term I'll introduce later, mission creep, where you cross over, but serving as an adjunct. And one of the ways that we serve as an adjunct is, one, having awareness, certainly, of what the treatment plan is, and confirming information for treatment and for the team, providing some information to identify discrepancies, supporting treatment goals, etc. And then we are doing this, serving as an adjunct to treatment, through the collaborative application of the risk-need responsivity model, the collaborative application of that model. All right, so now I alluded to this, and now we'll just kind of illustrate it even more to make a number of other points. It says there the traditional model of probation supervision, which is actually a little bit misleading, because those of you that know the history of probation in this country will know that it did not start out the way it eventually evolved to. But many folks ascribe to probation a punitive role. And some of you that are in probation right now, if you don't know, you should know that there is a narrative right now that's going across the country that probation in this country today is outdated, that probation has failed, that probation is too big, that probation is, we need to quote unquote reform probation. And what those groups talk about is probation from just a, here's the term, trail them, nail them, jail them perspective, where our only focus or surveillance, just enforcing laws, conditions, and rules, and being, again, entirely reactive, which was candidly part of the introduction I got when I started. But that's what I will call right now, for these purposes, a traditional model of probation. In other words, it's just reactive, catching somebody when they're doing something wrong, arresting them and revoking them. And as an illustration of this, I will tell you that back in the, I'll say, just before we got started in the drug court programs in Orange County, this was the supervision strategy of the Orange County Probation Department in the early 90s. I'm confessing here now, and I'm not bragging about this, but the supervision strategy went like this. First dirty drug test, 30 days in jail. Second dirty drug test, 60 days in jail. Third dirty drug test, state prison recommendation. That was our supervision strategy. That's what we brought to the table. Not necessarily in the drug courts we set up, but I'm just saying from a probation standpoint. And many of our meetings with individuals on probation went like this. Have you had any police contacts since I last saw you? Have you had a change of address? Okay. Have you made your payments? Great. Come back and see me in 2 weeks. That was the engagement. That was what we did. That was old school probation. But in the context of supervision in a recovery court, what I'm suggesting to you is the optimal model. I'll use the term balanced approach model of probation, where we actually do focus on both the enforcement or enforcement role and a social work responsibility. And the history lesson for you history buffs is when probation started back in 1841 in Boston, Massachusetts, John Augustus, the first probation officer, it was entirely social work focused. And John Augustus, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, basically said he would take individuals whom the court wanted to lock up. And he said, you don't need to lock these individuals up. If you entrust them to my care, I'll work with them. I'll try and help them get a job. He actually was focused on alcoholics at the time, help them get sober, and I will report back to you, blah, 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 this and that. That's how probation got started in this country, focused really on the social work aspect. And it wasn't until, candidly, what I would describe to you as the crime control era of the criminal justice system, which starts maybe in the mid 70s, peaks in the 80s, when crime raised significantly in this country and probation took on much more of the enforcement aspects that many people know it to be today. But I digress a little bit. So in the balanced approach model, there's the focus on both the accountability and behavior change. And some of you may have heard now of a role that's being tied to our probation roles. And if you're APPA involved, American Probation and Parole Association, and President Brian Lovins talks about this and has written about it, that probation officers playing a coach role, coaching individuals that are under supervision towards the behavior change. And what I'm suggesting to you is that that coach role is part of the balanced approach model, because we never can leave the enforcement and accountability responsibilities. But at the same time, we need to be equally focused on, again, behavior change and social work. And that is the model that is ideally suited for recovery courts. So taking us through that balanced approach model and what we're bringing to recovery courts and supporting the effort of facilitating behavior change. This is just a quick slide on some tools, is the way that I'm framing it. Again, if we were in person, I'd ask you, how many of you are familiar with core correctional practices? Or I would say it another way, how many of you have had EPICS training, effective practices in correctional supervision, or STAR training, strategic techniques aimed at reducing rearrest? If you've been through those training programs, you essentially have been taught how to deliver core correctional practices, which I list here as a set of skills and even interventions that are basically designed to strengthen the therapeutic aspect of supervision. Here it says the therapeutic potential in a relationship between a person under supervision and the supervision officer. I apologize a little bit if this is not new to you, if you've been a probation officer and you've heard these already. So I'm just going to reaffirm that this is a best practice, and there's some evidence around these practices. So I stopped short of saying evidence-based practices, but certainly a best practice. But in core correctional practices, these are the skill sets we learn: the effective use of authority, our authority as a supervision entity, pro-social modeling, effective reinforcement and approval, effective disapproval, problem-solving skills, relationship skills. Now, these are the ones that I picked now. They can be worded differently in some of the models that I just referenced, but the bottom line is, for some individuals that do supervision, a lot of what we list here as competencies may really come, I'll almost say naturally or intuitively. How to sit down and talk with an individual when they've made a bad decision, violated the terms of supervision, violated the terms of the program, and you have the conversation with them. Okay, say, now tell me what you were thinking when you went through that. What were you thinking? And that person will sit down and walk through that. And then what your response will be to help them dissect that decision-making process and say to them something like, okay, well, when you're in that situation the next time, what are some other options that you might be able to pursue? And then you'll complete that conversation. That actually is the intervention called effective disapproval. So I certainly trained my officers in this in San Diego, and put in a pretty intensive training program, trying to get to a point where there was some level of competency. So that, again, my focus was trying to enhance their skills to deliver supervision in this way. Now, there are a number of different interventions here, but one of the reasons that I'm such a proponent of the CCPs is they're designed towards cognitive restructuring. And when we have individuals in recovery courts that are being tasked with CBT, or are being asked to, are being referred to, or being engaged in CBT programs like MRT, Thinking for Change, there are a number of them. If you know those programs, you know that there's homework, frequently homework assignments, and those programs themselves are focused on trying to do some cognitive restructuring. The skill sets that are available in the CCPs work well with some of those manualized curriculums of the CBTs. And I'm throwing acronyms around here and there, so I apologize if I'm confusing. But those are sets of tools. Okay, now, coming on still, what I'm doing is I talked about the balanced approach. I talked about some of the tools that are a part of the balanced approach, the CCPs. So here we'll get to some practices that I'll just highlight very, very quickly, because I don't know the extent to which all of you have been exposed to and understand what people called evidence-based practices. And I always say for community supervision. The term EBPs, evidence-based practices, probably has become very cliche-ish, if you will. We throw that term out all of the time now, or maybe we don't anymore, but I know that I have been talking about those terms since 2003. And my experience is, and I'd be really curious if you all haven't had this experience too, but sometimes people will use the term and I don't really know if they know what they're talking about, or if they know what they're saying. I don't want to say that in a demeaning way, but I encourage you, when you hear somebody to say EBPs, ask them, what do you mean? This is what we mean. This is what the National Institute of Corrections put out, what was it, 2003, 2004, that are the practices that do have research support that say if these things are done with some level of fidelity, they're associated with improved outcomes for justice-involved populations. This is, again, part of a frame. And the first one should be a surprise to no one in this webinar. Assess risk. We'll be talking about that more with risk need responsivity. Enhance the internal motivation of the individuals that you're working with. You want to get them involved in the change process. Motivate them to want to help change their behavior. Use positive reinforcement. You see the behaviors that you're wanting the individual to do, you reinforce that, or you reinforce the positive steps. Targeting specific behaviors. And as we'll see here in just a second, that's talking about targeting the behaviors that are related to the criminal conduct. Criminogenic needs, that's just a little highlight there. Teaching new skills. That may involve role play, but it certainly involves recognizing where individuals are skill deficient and trying to, if not teach them directly from your own perspective, engage them in services where they can learn those new skills. And then the literal language says use of community resources, but this is talking about using programs in the community in lieu of or instead of confinement, and then track those outcomes. And some of you are going to hold me to the task that there are actually 8 EBPs, and I just put these 7 for these purposes right now. So now, all of that kind of set up to hit on the supervision role in the context of a recovery court, and now how that applies to risk need responsivity in a recovery court. And the way that I like to frame this is the RNR model operationalizes, or is a way to operationalize, those 7 evidence-based practices. But in a recovery court, it's not just our role alone. It's not just probation engaged with the individual. We have to do it with a team. So how can we do that? So first, a little bit of background on the risk need responsivity model. Again, I'm expecting that many of you know a little bit about it. So I've taken this from a couple of different sources. But the first thing to understand is the risk need responsivity model is not new. Those of you that are familiar with it know that already, that it itself is the product of, I think, decades of research around justice-involved populations and what has been effective in helping to improve outcomes, reduce recidivism, ultimately change behavior. It says risk needs responsivity theory is based on theories of behavioral psychology, and it supports that crime prevention, and when I say crime prevention, I'm gonna talk about behavior change, through services targeted for individual criminogenic risk factors. So criminogenic, first time I've used the term today, again, and all of you have heard it by now, I'm sure, but in the context that we're talking about, criminogenic needs. They are actually, of the risk factors that predict recidivism, criminogenic needs are those dynamic factors that can be addressed, can be changed in order to achieve behavior change and reduce recidivism. So that's what we're talking about when we say criminogenic. That's the background on risk need responsivity. Said another way, in a more simple way, risk tells us who we should be targeting, who we should be focusing our highest level of supervision and intervention on. Need tells us what to focus on, and then responsivity tells us how to intervene. Responsivity factors, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. This, again, is just repeating that with a little bit more, matching the level of service to the participants. And I'm expecting that most of you in this webinar have now heard the message, the literature, that recovery courts, and certainly recovery courts that are trying to adhere to best practices, and the best practices that NADCP has put out, should be focused on high risk and high need. High risk and high need. The reason for that was because of the higher level of supervision and services that recovery courts these years provide is successfully impactful on a high risk, high need population. That's what the research is telling us. That's what we know. Back in 1995, we didn't know that. Now in 2021, that point is very, very clear. So again, the need principle talks about addressing criminogenic needs and clinical issues. So when the purest background on RNR focuses on criminogenic need, but here in the context of a recovery court, I'm saying that we need to be addressing both the criminogenic need and the clinical diagnosis. So criminogenic needs are different than a clinical diagnosis, but there may be a relationship between the two. So that's one of the, I won't say first new points, but it's important to the context of our conversation. Then the responsivity principle, again, are factors that are barriers to full rehabilitation. So responsivity here, it says, talks about cognitive behavioral treatment, tailoring the intervention to the learning style, motivation, etc., and strengths of a participant. Said another way, responsivity involves meeting the individual where they are, recognizing who they are, not who they are, but what are the factors influencing their life right now that lead them to where they are. So now talking about the collaboration, and I'm gonna have to pick up the pace, I think, here a little bit. No, and Marie, please keep me on point. I'm trying to watch my time. But when we are talking about the collaborative application of the risk need responsivity model in the context of a recovery court, I'm breaking this down into what's the supervision contribution, and then I will also talk about what is the treatment contribution. So from the supervision standpoint, we're addressing the who, high risk, and also the what, criminogenic need. So part of our role here is we're identifying the who, because in the way that we've set up our recovery courts, we're doing, or should be doing, the criminogenic risk need assessment early on to confirm that the participants that we want to bring in are high risk and high need, high criminogenic need. I'll stop for just a second And I will say, just to make the point here, that when we're talking about the different tools that we use, those of you that are from probation know, you know which tool you're using in Tennessee. I don't actually know which one you use. In San Diego and California, we use the Compass, the LSI are those tools. And those tools from a criminogenic need standpoint, by the way, are just screen the criminogenic need. They are not assessments of criminogenic need. They are just screens of criminogenic need. They are not predictive on certain offense types. They are not predictive on DUI offenders. They are not predictive on sex offenders. Not that you're necessarily looking to bring someone who's been convicted of a sex crime into your recovery court. They also may not be predictive on domestic violence offenders. So what I'm suggesting there is, if you really want, if your program is targeting DUI offenders, if you use the traditional criminogenic risk needs tools, generally the DUI offenders will score out low risk on those, especially if they don't have an extensive other criminal history and they have an alcohol problem. They will. The point there is, I'm talking general criminogenic risk, but our role, identifying the risk. But again, this next bullet is what we made earlier, that our contribution to the collaborative application of RNR is beyond just surveillance and compliance. Don't let your team rabbit hole you into just being the got you piece. You just catch them. You guys catch them. We'll do everything else. No, don't let them do that. Because your greater contribution here is the balanced approach model. The punishment and deterrence produces a short-term effect. When we look at the research, and it's in part of the standards actually, that those are short-term effects when we're only punishment focused. So again, our role that we're bringing here, as I talked about earlier, is the balanced approach model. And you already heard me talk about using the tools of core correctional practices. So treatment, I hope I've got some treatment folks, some clinicians in the room. Your contribution is, see, the what, also the what, because you're helping us identify what are the clinical issues that this individual has. And so when I'm saying clinical issues, yes, I am talking about substance use disorder. Yes, I'm talking about mental illness symptoms. And I'm also talking about, because some of you are probably operating some veterans treatment courts, things like PTSD, traumatic brain injury. You're helping us identify that what. And your role is to be delivering on the how, on the different interventions, not to the exclusion of supervision, by the way. But again, remember what we said early, that supervision's role is an adjunct to treatment. So here we're going to be talking about focusing on general and specific responsivity factors. And I will talk about that in some detail in just a second. And using, again, some both clinical and cognitive behavioral interventions to treat those disorders. So reducing recidivism, and here's a message to the clinicians, and I actually got this message from some clinicians when we had this conversation before. Reducing recidivism and criminal justice involvement become part of treatment and recovery goals. And the reason that's significant is, outside of maybe the environment of the justice system, the clinicians are thinking about helping their patients, their clients, get better. And that's what they want to do. And certainly we're saying you bring that as well. But in the context of a recovery court, you're helping them get better, which is going to also help them reduce recidivism and their justice system involvement. Okay, now, exclamation point here, because the collaborative or case management and the integrated case planning is the core, it's the key piece to this collaboration. That's what has to happen. And I kind of try to use those terms, integrated case planning and collaborative case management, because this is from my own experience in almost 30 years of working in these treatment courts and kind of seeing this, that there has to be this synergy almost between supervision and treatment to make this work in order to achieve these outcomes. But this collaboration is the core. So collaborative case management is the process that supervision and treatment join in the effort to provide these intervention services. So the other practices that I talked about, assessment planning, engagement, monitoring, advocacy have to be coordinated. And what that speaks to is the elements of what otherwise might be multiple case plans have to be shared, and client activities and expectations have to be coordinated and monitored. What do you mean by that, Mack? What are you talking about? Here's what I mean by that. So what are some of the barriers to this collaboration? Think about it for just a second. And again, in almost 30 years of working with recovery courts all over the country. I've never met one, I've never seen one that didn't in some way navigate this space, not once. Some of them do it quite well. Some of them do it through trial and error. Some of them do it just because the team players just happen to have personalities that match, but everybody does it, has to do it, or you end up running into problems. But part of the barriers are treatment has expectations, supervision has expectations, the court has requirements and expectations. What are in your phase expectations? And then, this is also really important, there may be multiple team players who consider themselves playing an independent case management role. Remember, I talked to you about the court playing a collective case management role. So the challenge is coordinating that effort to address both the criminogenic and clinical risk and needs. So here's another part of the challenge. In this era of evidence-based practices of community supervision, what probation departments all over the country, you probation officers in this room, I'll be surprised if this isn't emphasized to you, that you do your own case plan, that you do case planning. That certainly is something I emphasized in my department. And this is outside of a recovery court. You have to have a case plan. So what does treatment do when they're providing treatment services to individuals? They develop a treatment plan. Now, if your recovery court has multiple treatment providers or your individuals are seeing multiple people, how many plans does that individual have? And then other questions to ask, do all of you on your team know what is on each plan? Does the participant know what is on each plan? If the participant's reporting to a probation officer, the probation officer's got a case plan, he's reporting to a clinician, clinician's got that plan. Do the plans conflict? Are there contradictions? And this last line comes from a training I recently did with a team, because we were having this conversation and the judge interrupts and says, well, which plan do I follow? That's what integrated case planning and collaborative case management is designed to answer. And what happens when we don't answer that question is that there may well be gaps in services. We might miss something, arguably, even with all that planning going on, or there might be a duplication of services. And as I just mentioned, there could be conflicting directions to the participant. Think about this for a second. You're a probation officer, you've got somebody in the recovery court, high risk, clearly high risk, high need, never had a job in his life. He's been selling drugs, he's been using drugs, and all of a sudden he's there. And you do your assessment, and the assessment comes out and says, hey, this guy really needs a job. So you're going to say to him, hey, buddy, you need to get a job, and you need to get a job fast. Meanwhile, he goes to see his clinician. The clinician it does an assessment that sees the history of trauma in his background. He's still dealing with a lot of trauma. And the clinician says, don't worry about getting a job right now. You really need some other things. We need to get you in treatment. So don't, that job search is just adding to your stress. Don't do that. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, but absent the effort to coordinate, those kinds of things can happen. So it easily produces some confusion for the participants. And remember, some of them don't need a whole lot of incentive to manipulate, triangulate, or kind of play the team members against each other. And mission creep means when we kind of go into each other's lane, go into each other's space. But absent the effort to really coordinate this, that is a potential product. And ultimately, that can result in poorer outcomes for the population that we're trying to serve. How is it going to result in poorer outcomes? Because it's hard. It's hard for the individual, and they've got multiple bosses telling them to do multiple things. On top of it, they're dealing with a severe substance use disorder. Who knows what their family life is like? And despite our best efforts, we're not making it easier for them. So that takes us to the effort of integrated case planning and collaborative case management. What does that mean?
And hey, Mac, I just want to let you know that you've got 25 minutes. So you're in good shape right now.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'm still going to give you your timers, but
that you're an angel, Marie. I really appreciate that, because I keep trying to check my timer. It's not really helping me. But so 25 minutes. Are there questions, Marie? Are there any questions coming up?
No, lots of. I mean, text is going off because people are texting me and people are saying great things in the chat about just really your information resonating. No
Okay.
questions yet.
All right. That helps me because I wanted to make sure whether or not I needed to leave time. But okay, so now what are we talking about in terms of the integrated case planning and collaborative case management? And here are some real just basic things about case planning. And this doesn't even necessarily have anything, or at least the first couple of bullets don't necessarily focus on the collaborative application, just basic case planning. And number one rule, we don't want to overwhelm this participant. Again, think of what we just talked about in terms of everything that they're being presented with, especially in the early phases. And if you haven't already, think back to right now what you are requiring your participants to do in the first phase. And think about what else is happening in the first phase if you have a high-risk, high-need individual with a severe substance use disorder who may have co-occurring disorders. What are you asking them to do there? And again, how many different plans are they going to be accountable to? So those of you that have done case planning, you've certainly done case planning training, you know that you don't case plan to, you case plan with. So you're involving the participant in the development of the plan. Certainly you will have, and I will make this point again later, hopefully have completed your assessment, or maybe you're certainly having this conversation with the individuals as a part of your deeper assessment, but you need to get their input. You need to engage them on what you're finding in the assessment, what you're thinking are priority areas, and get their participation in it. And then prioritize the goals that may be produced from the assessment information. And you see that we put there both proximal and distal. And I will expect that you've been exposed to, had some instruction on what proximal and distal are. If you haven't, proximal goals or proximal behaviors are those that are easier to do, easier to accomplish. Distal goals or distal behaviors are those that are more difficult. Again, the easiest example is for the individual with the severe substance use disorder. Sobriety is a distal goal. It is a distal goal. As much as we want it, it's not something that's going to be easy for them to do. So, but in terms of how you develop a plan for them to work towards, you want to be thinking about proximal and distal goals. What do we want them to do first that might be preparatory for something we'll want them to do later? And then make sure that the goals that you develop meet the SMART standard. And this is, again, because the plan is not just for you and that individual. It's not just for you as the probation officer and the person you're supervising. Clinician is not just for you as a treatment plan and the person that you're providing services to. It's really for the whole team, including the participant. So the plan needs to have goals that are specific, are measurable, attainable, relevant to the issues, and time-based, ideally. We want to accomplish some of these things within this particular time frame. So again, for the severe substance use disorder person, we used to say addict. I'm not saying addict right now. And we want them to be certainly sober and in full recovery. That might not be the first goal that we prioritize on. Maybe it's just even attending and participating in treatment is really the first goal. And again, I'm giving you just an application of what we mean in terms of that. But the plan must identify and address criminogenic needs, and you should know the risk level, and whatever is the clinical diagnosis, what are we dealing with from a clinical perspective here, and also identify the responsivity needs that might be involved. That's towards integrated case planning. It should address those things. Your team should be able to see, okay, this is the criminogenic areas that he scored high in. He's at this risk level, he or she. These are the clinical issues. These are the responsivity factors. A well-conceived case plan is going to give you that. So, and then this is really important too, because now we're talking about addressing responsivity factors. And responsivity factors include, not limited to, are things like homelessness, unemployment is a responsivity factor. Mental illness symptoms are actually a responsivity factor. home environment, things along those lines. Those are examples of responsivity factors. And the one point I really do want to stress here, like you've heard me talk about criminogenic needs, those that are crime causing. There are also factors that predict recidivism that are not criminogenic, meaning that they're not crime causing. Homelessness is an example. That's a factor, or unemployment might even a better example. And what that means is, again, just because you don't have a job does not mean necessarily that you engage in criminal conduct. Many people that don't have jobs don't commit crimes. Many people that are homeless don't commit crimes. But a lot of people, a lot of high-risk folks that have come into the system have those histories behind them. So my point again is just trying to give an illustration of responsivity factors. So you see here, there's a breakdown. And this is what the research says. And if you haven't read this, this research is actually really well laid out in the best practice standards manual in terms of the support for what I'm saying to you here right now. So this is not a Mack Jenkins opinion. This is research supported from, again, decades of research on justice-involved population, but it makes a difference when how you address these factors. So this applies to your case planning. So the general responsivity factors, again, homelessness, detoxing, withdrawal, symptoms, those should be the priorities in case planning. When your assessment is producing someone who's high risk and high needs, and you see that homelessness is an issue, they're experiencing mental health systems, those will be the priority. We want to work on getting them stably housed someplace, getting their detox and withdrawal at least under some level of control, addressing to some degree the mental health system so you get to some stabilization point before you start holding them to task on the criminogenic issues. Common criminogenic, a dynamic factor of predicting recidivism is what we know as criminal thinking, criminal associates, antisocial values, poor use of leisure time. Those are among the criminogenic needs that can be crime causing. The first factors that we should be addressing is the general responsivity issues. Get them stable first, and to a period of some stability, then we start to the referral or engagement in the CBT programs, if you will, that are going to address the criminal thinking, and then move to a point where, and if you know those programs, you know that some of them are open groups, some of them are closed groups. They're generally structured groups, and there's start period, there's an end period, but more than even the start period and end period, listen for the change talk. Listen for the accepting of some level of responsibility. Listen for the better decision-making. Listen for the conversations that you have with these individuals should be different than the earlier conversations after they've completed these programs. And that can show you that we're making good progress towards whatever might be those identified criminogenic needs. From there, you move into the maintenance issues. So a great maintenance example of a responsivity issue is the employment issue. So again, here, although a lot of people will tell you, with all these folks, I've heard it 1,000 times from community groups I've talked to, get them a job. All he needs is a job. If you get them a job, they'll straighten out. Well, with these individuals with high risk and high need issues, we're not going to be focused on getting them employed right away, especially if they have these other factors. That comes later. Be thinking also about what your requirements are in your phase structures and see when you're having these different requirements. So the third step are these maintenance needs. These are the things that, again, don't cause crime, but if you don't address them, they're going to undermine some of the other work that you're doing. So literary skills, trying to do what you can for their poverty situation, addressing the educational engagement, that comes after that. And then after you've hopefully made some progress in this regard, then you want to start talking to them about the restitution they owe, or whatever are their financial obligations, or having them do community service in that sequence. The failure to address these responsivity factors in this order can undermine your overall efforts. It's a part of collaborative case management. Oops. Let me go back here. How am I doing on time now?
You're 15 minutes out.
Okay. So that should say what treatment needs to know from supervision. It says with treatment from supervision. So this is what I'm suggesting supports the collaboration. And those of you that are clinicians, I'm suggesting this, you can fill this list yourself if you think it's incomplete, or you should, what I'm saying is you should have this conversation. What you should know from supervision is the assessed risk level, the highest scoring criminogenic needs. You should know an overview of the home environment. So obviously one of the things I'm saying to you, all of you that are probation folks, is that home visits is a practice. I didn't necessarily put those kinds of practices in this presentation because I wanted to focus on in a different area, but giving some picture of the home environment, because assessment of the recovery environment is important to a clinical assessment, I have been taught. You want to also share the criminal history, because absent your sharing, you being as supervision officers, the holder of the criminal history, how will the clinicians know that? How will the team know it? Certainly prosecutors on the team have some access to it, and they should certainly be a part of sharing it. But I know in California, we have that history from probation standpoints. We're bringing that to the table. And you have to bring that to the table because remember, as part of their clinical assessment, again, what many of the clinicians are relying on is self-reported information. So what we're trying to do is to confirm, to clarify, both from an informational standpoint and both from getting out and seeing their home. So those are some of the things I'm suggesting that treatment needs to hear from supervision. So treatment providers, make this list. Probation officers, make this list. And then have this conversation yourselves. What do you need to hear? And then what does supervision need to hear from treatment? Again, from my conversation so far, hopefully you picked up on some of these points. But supervision needs to know what the mental health issues are and what is the diagnosis, not just supervision, again, focusing on that collaboration, but the entire team does. But this is important for structuring supervision if those things aren't readily apparent. Trauma history is critically important for, again, the entire team, but certainly who's ever responsible for supervision. And I will tell you that we don't necessarily get the trauma history in a pre-sentence investigation, in the collective history that probation gets, unless there's been a more recent effort to screen trauma, to collect trauma information in probation agencies and probation departments. I will confess to you, I told you 40 plus years in the criminal justice system and doing probation supervision. And it wasn't until I was the chief in San Diego and we were reaching out to expand some of our services that I recognized and was made aware of the exposure and impact of trauma on a justice-involved population. I didn't know. I didn't know. It wasn't part of my training. Certainly wasn't part of my probation training. It wasn't even necessarily part of my education. But my point is, we know a lot about it now. We know the impact of trauma. We have a better understanding of what trauma is and how it can impact behavior. Clinicians, you have to share that with us in terms of what you've learned. Again, the priority of the clinical areas to be addressed, specifically some relapse triggers that the individual may be involved in, that you get that, and then just some general treatment progress. And we don't need to know. We don't need to know if that trauma is a sexual abuse trauma. We don't need to know the details of that, of what occurred. We certainly need to will respect the relationship between clinicians and their patients. But this conversation has to be had between the two. So now what I'm suggesting, and I'm trying to wind down here, are some competencies for treatment providers that are engaged in this collaborative effort of the delivery of risk, need, and responsivity. So these are some things you need to know. So another way of looking at this, look at this list, if you will, clinicians in the room, kind of give it a score from 1 to 5. 1 being, I don't know anything about that. 5 being, Mac, I got this nailed. I know this really well. Score yourself in each one of these areas, because in order to have this collaboration successfully or effectively, you need to know something about evidence-based practices for community corrections. And I just gave you the 7 of those. You need to know something about more than what I'm giving you about the risk, need, and responsivity model. You need to know criminogenic risk factors. There are 8 factors that predict recidivism. Yeah, you're going to say, Mac, why didn't you tell us? Oh, I'm sorry, we're running out of time a little bit. But you need to know what those are. You need to know general supervision terms and practices. You need to know a little bit about criminal case processing. What does it mean that someone's pled guilty? Are they on formal probation supervision, or they're not under probation supervision, or they're under diversion, or they're under deferred entry of judgment, deferred delivery of judgment? You need to know those things. Certainly some cognitive behavioral interventions, and have a good sense of probation's traditional role versus the recovery role, the one that I talked about earlier that they should be bringing. And then the other thing you should know, and those of you that are experienced on treatment court, you've already mastered this, hopefully. Those of you that are new may not, because it's not intuitive. How to work as part of an interdisciplinary team in a judicially supervised program. Some technical assistance I just did recently on a court that was having huge problems was because the treatment component that was in that team really didn't have a clue of what it meant to be working in a treatment court or recovery court under a judicial program. One of the things I told them is these are the court's cases. Certainly you're providing some treatment services and you have an interest in them, but you need to understand that these individuals are under the court's authority and you're working in an interdisciplinary team. So score yourself in each one of those areas. If you're all fives, and you don't even listen to a word that I'm saying. But if you're a 1 or lesser than in any area, you've just identified some further training you need to get. So from the supervision standpoint, these are things probation officers you need to know. Do the same thing. Do a Likert scale on each one of these things. 1 being you're a novice, 5 being you've got this nailed. You need to know something about severe substance use disorder. I think you know, you may be doing this for a long period of time. It might be on point, but do you know? Trauma and its impact. What is your level of knowledge about what trauma is and how it impacts the behavior of individuals that you're working with? What is psychopharmacology? The impact of drugs on the brain. Where's your score on that? Is it a 1 or a 5? I am a huge believer in the stages of change literature. Carlo Di Clemente, Nicholas Petraska. If you've read a lot of what they've done, that literature was itself the product of years of research on addicts, as I recall. So what are the stages of change? Pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance. How well do you know that? How well does it apply to the individuals that you're working with? You already heard me refer to core correctional practices. I know my officers hated it when I imposed that training on them, but still, I'm suggesting to you those are important tools that can help us do our job better. You also do need to have a general understanding of general treatment approaches, what treatment is and what treatment is not. In 1995, that was the first lesson that I learned from the clinician that I worked with when we started our treatment programs in Orange County, California. He sat out and he told me, Mac, this is what treatment means. I had an idea, I didn't know. So I had to learn that. And then you certainly motivational interviewing skills. And because we are suggesting proactive supervision that does involve going out into people's homes, into people's communities where they live and breathe and interact, you also need to have some field safety skills, because that is not always a safe venture. And you too, supervise the probation officers as well. You need to know the ins and outs, the pitfalls, the barriers, and the opportunities of working in an interdisciplinary team. Part of that goes back to what I said before, knowing the information that you need to give to treatment and need to get from treatment with properly worded release of information forms. I didn't put that in, but that's an important critical practice to the collaborative application of risk need responsivity. So the integrated case plan looks like this. It has the prioritized criminogenic needs. It does what I said earlier. It will identify the clinical diagnosis based on the risk needs and clinical assessments and the goals to be achieved. And importantly, the case plan should talk about the activities the participant should undertake to achieve the goals with appropriate guidelines. And I am, by the way, talking about a single document, not your supervision plan, not the treatment plan. Remember what I said before, when the judge asks, whose plan should I follow? The team should have access to an overarching case plan that is a result of this collaboration. So everybody knows, prosecutor, defense, coordinator for VTCs, mentor coordinator, the JSO, I'm sorry, the VJO, I always say JSO, VJO. What are the goals we're working on here? What is the risk level? What are the goals? What's proximal? What's distal? What do we want them to do? And how are they doing? So that's what the case plan should look like. Everybody on the team should have it. So, and at a minimum, in terms of evaluating those plans, how am I doing, Marie?
You're 6 minutes out.
Okay, all right, I think we're going to end right on time. At a minimum, I'm suggesting this script for your pre-court staffing discussions. to kind of tie these things together. So many of you probably have this nailed already. I hope that you do. Some of you that are newer to it, I'm suggesting to you some things that you certainly should be talking about. You should be. The first one says assessment results, both risk need and clinical, when you're addressing eligibility and program admittance. If you're going to target high risk, high need individuals, as the literature is suggesting right now, then that's part of the conversation. You should learn that early on when you staff. Yes, I did my risk need assessment. This guy certainly does score out as high risk, and these are the needs. And depending upon the tool that's used, it will give you both of those things. Now, some of these other things are certainly maybe a part of the initial conversation when you talk about the individual, but I'm also suggesting that these are things to talk about in the pre-court staffings before the status hearings. In other words, progress reviews. And the risk level, again, and the identified needs, and then the progress towards the goals. If you have the goals very clearly laid out and you have the activities clearly laid out, this is a simple conversation that you can focus on and say, how is he doing? We wanted this individual to be at this point. We wanted them to be through their detox. We wanted them to be enrolled in their early stages of their intensive outpatient program. Where are they? How are they doing on those things? And then there's the general treatment update and treatment. You see what we're suggesting here. Have they been coming to treatment? What's their participation like? Are they engaged? What's the symptom status look like? Are they still showing these symptoms? Supervision, some of the things that you certainly can share. How many times you've seen them since the last status hearing or the last pre-court staffing? Have you done a home visit? How many times have you been in the home? Has there been a change in the home environment? Has there been a change in who they're living with? What was the general feel in the home there? And certainly you see drug testing results. And then that should set up the stage for how you as a team are going to be responding to behaviors, because you will identify if there are behaviors that you need to respond to. Are you going to be focusing on some heavier incentives right now? Are there some things where we need to sanction or respond to? And then what therapeutic adjustments are called for. The therapeutic adjustments come from the clinicians. And this is also sets up the conversation about phase advancement requirements, and ultimately also sets up the conversation about possible termination, as well as graduating from the program. Some of that may seem basic to you, but I'm just suggesting to you that certainly the pre-court staffing should be scripted. I've sat in on so many staffings, and I've seen so many that are so completely disjointed. And I kind of wonder how the team is getting to where they need to get to with those individuals. But I've sat in on some that I'd say, wow, they've really got this down well. They're really focusing on the things. I've sat in on some where they include the conversation about where the individuals are on the stages of change. So we're finishing with a checklist. And these are things to ask you. I gave you another checklist on the competencies. But here's something, and I guess I seem to be prioritizing talking to the supervision officers, but not just them. But I ask, this is what you should ask yourself. Do you have a seamless working relationship with the treatment providers on your court? And that's the word that I use. It should be seamless. The wider the gaps in your relationship, I'm going to suggest to you the worse the outcomes. So if you're doing this virtually right now, but if you happen to be in a room with your treatment persons, look over at them, make eye contact and say, it's got to be us together, that sort of a thing. So if we were all together, that's what I would have you do, is I would have you guys look at each other and kind of ask that question. And then ask yourself this too. This is the supervision officers. Do you just refer to treatment, or do you work with them? Because there is a difference. And what I've been talking about is working with them. And then the other ones, maybe they're a little bit redundant. Do you complete the risk need assessment and share the information? And then obviously what we talked about before, are you developing case plans that identify and target the criminogenic needs? Do you share those goals? And then the last one too, how are you and the treatment providers addressing general and specific responsivity? Treatment providers, I can ask you, how much do you know, or did you know about responsivity factors? And you might put that on your reading list. So this is the summary. In recovery court, it has to be accomplished through a collaborative application of the RNR model. Reiterating what I just said, there has to be a seamless working relationship, certainly between supervision and treatment. And then that leads to the better working together of the entire recovery court teams. And there should be practical steps taken to build that collaboration, and then to strengthen it and to maintain it. And I've tried to touch on what some of those steps are. With that, that concludes my conversation this morning. So Marie, how am I time-wise?
You are like, you're right there. It is 12:30.
All right.
Thank you so much, Mac. Lots of great feedback in the chat. Like I said, people are texting me. Everybody wants a copy and all of that stuff.
I hope so. I hope it's helpful. I really legitimately, sincerely hope it's helpful, because that's my intent.
If you look at the chat, it is definitely helpful. And if we were in person, we would be hearing lots of clapping happening, because everybody is clapping in their offices or on their couches or wherever they happen to be right now listening to this. And now everybody also knows why I have enjoyed training with and learning from you, Mac. That's one of the great things about being faculty with NDCI and Justice for Vets, is you get to meet these people and invite them to come speak at the conference. Well, and Mac is definitely somebody I've been excited to make sure you guys were exposed to. So
thank you, Marie. May I just say this too? I'm actually doing a session at the conference on just this, on just the collaboration. This has been a little bit broader conversation, but my session, one of my sessions at the conference, is just titled Integrated Case Planning and Collaborative Case Management. And there we'll get into examples of case plan, examples of progress reviews, and we'll work through scenarios. So that's what we're doing at the conference.
Yeah, so if you're going to the conference, you can look for Mac. I know I certainly am going to. Thank you so much. I'm going to do some housekeeping, and then we are done for the conference. But I know that there might be some questions about the conference materials. Everything's going to go on our website under the pivot menu. We will email you that information so that you know where to find that stuff. All the recordings of everything that we've been able to record at the conference is going to go on the TARCP YouTube channel. And we will email out that link so that you can find all of that information on our YouTube channel. Evaluations are going to be emailed out either this afternoon or in the morning. And so you can complete your evaluation so that you can get your certificates. You will receive an email that will also have the form for you to complete for CLE. If you are an attorney and you want CLE, that is created and just ready to shoot out to you via email so that you can complete that electronically and we can get your CLE. And we will also have CEUs. Just be patient as we get all of this information sort of wrapped up and out to you. It may take a few weeks. I'm training with Matt next week. So, I mean, there's, it's me and a little bit of help. So just be patient as all of this stuff gets sent out. I want to make sure to thank my board and my conference committee and the workers that have helped moderate and get these sessions up and going. Mandy and Jennifer and Rebecca from the state, Anthony and Maria from TADIS, and of course, Kathleen. Kathleen has been hanging out in Remo for 3 days, hanging out with the sponsors and exhibitors and saying hello to you when you've come in and answered your questions or responded to your texts. She put her cell phone number on the landing page so that you guys could have somebody, even if she couldn't necessarily help you right away. So just make sure that you thank Kathleen because she has been a trooper and it has been my partner in this process. And I think that is everything in terms of what you guys might have for questions. If you do have questions and you want me to hang here for a second and ask a conference related question, I'm happy to do that to make sure that we get your questions answered. I don't know, Mac, if you're seeing the chat here. Everybody is just like, okay, good.
That's
my favorite presentation. Okay, wonderful presentation. Great job. Everybody's just
I'm gratified.
People are using all caps here.
I'm gratified that it's helpful. I believe in this. I believe in this, and this is, like I said, I'll shut up because I know it's your time now. So should I go ahead and step away?
You can, and I'll see you next week, Mac. Thank you so much. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
So if you have conference questions, I can answer those. I'll just stay on here just a few minutes, just in case I didn't cover. One of the things I didn't say is there are prize winners. Kathleen has put the prize winner information for yesterday out on the landing page. The prize winners are going to get notified via email. That's how she's doing it. She's sending an email letting you know you won. Again, it will take a little bit of time for us to sort of get those out to you. Some of those will happen electronically and some of those will be mailed to you. So you'll have to practice some patience before you get your Spa Finder card or whatever it is you won. For the CLE, the sessions that were CLE approved, by the way, were all in 1.25 hours, with the exception of the judge's discussion last night. That was one CLE. And Judge Ortega, I mean, not Judge, Dr. Ortega's session yesterday morning was a dual CLE credit for 1.25. For those of you that are curious about the amounts. Thank you, guys. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for your patience. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Gloria. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Sharon. Thanks, Judge Schweier. Thank you, Carla. Thanks, Will, and thank you for presenting for us yesterday. Thank you, Dustin. Thanks, Larry. Glad you were here, and thank you for making yourself available in Remo for everybody. Appreciate that. Thank you, Natasha. Thanks, Tracy. Wish I could have seen your face, Anthony. Thank you for chatting to me. You too. Have a great weekend. So far, no questions. So I guess that's good. I must have, my little fast laundry list there must have taken care of most of those questions, right?
You were very thorough.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to give another 60 seconds, and then if I don't see a question, Rebecca, I'll end it, okay? Unless you need to chat with me for some reason.
I'm good. Well, I'm sure we'll be chatting.
I'm sure we will too. If I'd have thought about it, I'd have given you a chance to say goodbye. I wasn't thinking about it. Mack was not kidding when he said he was going to go to the end.
I know.
He's like, I need help with the time because I'm just not sure I'm gonna.
That was really impressive.
I think I'm gonna be pushing it.
It was impressive that he exactly the time. I've never been able to do that.
No, me either. Me either. He's. I just love him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's one of the things I forgot to say to people is we have him on contract to actually do a webinar. It's sort of an advanced version of this.
Nice.
He and I we haven't set a date or anything, but I've got him on contract to do that later this year and to come back to the conference in December. So we'll have lots of Mack exposure by the time we hit the end of 2021. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else, so I'm going to go ahead and end it. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Marie.
Bye, everybody.
Everyone have a great weekend.
I'm sure you and I will chat. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Bye.